The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions, with both Ottawa and Beijing agreeing to reopen communication lines, potentially paving the way for a summit between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping.
Across the headlines this week, one story stands out. Canada and China are rebuilding ties after years of silence. Foreign Minister Anita Annan's visit to Beijing has reopened diplomatic channels, and both sides are now preparing for a possible summit between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Xi Jinping. For many in Washington, this news came as a shock. Only a year ago, relations between Ottawa and Beijing were frozen, strained by disputes over canola, seafood, and the detention of Canadian citizens. Yet now, the same two nations are moving toward dialogue, trade, and cooperation. What changed? The answer lies not in Beijing, but in Washington. President Donald Trump's trade policies were meant to protect American industry and bring Canada closer under U.S. control. Instead, his tariff war has fractured North America's supply chains and pushed Canada to look elsewhere. Trump's 25% import tax on medium and heavy trucks takes effect in November, adding to a long list of duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and furniture. The goal was to pressure Canada to return manufacturing jobs to U.S. soil. The result has been the opposite. Rather than yielding to Trump, Ottawa is quietly reshaping its global position, one trade deal, one conversation, and one handshake at a time. In Ottawa, the mood is cautious but determined. After months of failed negotiations with Washington, the Carney government has begun to de-escalate. A new 100-page order published this month removes dozens of counter-tariffs on both the U.S. and China. The policy shift is sweeping. Many categories of Chinese steel and aluminum, previously restricted, can now enter Canada duty-free. Tariffs on American steel, health equipment, and even construction materials have been reduced. One Ottawa housing project, for instance, received an exemption to import steel doors tax-free. The reaction at home has been mixed. Canada's steel industry warned that cheaper Chinese imports could flood the market. Ontario Premier Doug Ford urged a tougher line, saying the country must not bend under Trump's pressure. But Mark Carney took a different approach. There are times to hit back and times to talk, he told reporters. Now is the time to talk. Behind that calm tone lies a deeper calculation. Canada's auto sector has been hit hard since Stellantis announced it would move Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois. 3,000 Canadian jobs lost, 5,000 gained in the U.S. The same tariffs designed to boost American manufacturing have crippled Ontario's supply chain. By easing counter-tariffs, Carney is trying to stabilize costs for domestic producers and keep inflation from rising. More importantly, he's signaling to Washington that Canada still has options, and one of them is Beijing. As China hints at lifting restrictions on canola and seafood, both sides are preparing to discuss EV tariffs. If these talks succeed, it would mark the first real thaw between the two countries since 2018. For Carney, it is not about choosing China over the U.S. It is about restoring leverage in a world where Trump controls the economic board.
Trump's tariffs were supposed to isolate China and reinforce U.S. dominance in North American trade. Instead, they have created an opening that China is quick to exploit. Beijing's economy has slowed, and exports need new markets. Canada, a G7 democracy with strained U.S. ties, fits perfectly. By reopening trade with Ottawa, China gains both an economic partner and a diplomatic bridge into the Western world. For the United States, this shift carries real consequences. Canadian importers now find Chinese metals and components cheaper than U.S. products weighed down by tariffs. Canadian farmers, previously locked out of Chinese markets, may regain access for canola and pork. In short, China is regaining ground through the very system Washington tried to weaponize. Meanwhile, the U.S. industrial heartland, the Midwest, is feeling the cost. Higher steel and transport prices are eating into profits. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American construction firms have seen material costs rise by nearly 12% since early 2024. For them, Trump's trade war is not protection, it is punishment. And yet, the ripple effects stretch far beyond economics. Global investors are quietly adjusting their forecasts, shifting billions of dollars from U.S. assets into Canada's resource and manufacturing sectors. Ottawa's reputation as a stable gateway to both Western and Asian markets is gaining traction, while America's unpredictability under Trump is driving partners to hedge their bets. Even European automakers are now eyeing joint ventures in Canada to bypass U.S. tariffs and access cheaper Chinese materials. What began as a tariff wall has become a bridge, one connecting Beijing to North America through Canadian soil. And as Ottawa reopens its doors to Chinese trade, American exporters risk losing a loyal customer. Canada remains the United States' largest export market. If even a fraction of that commerce shifts toward Asia, U.S. manufacturers could lose billions in annual revenue. The irony is sharp. Trump promised to bring jobs home and weaken Beijing's reach. But his approach has pushed Canada, America's closest ally, to cooperate with China instead. The more Washington tightens, the more Ottawa looks for air.
For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's economy. Every major supply chain, from autos to agriculture, ran through the United States. But that order is now shifting. Canada is quietly building a more independent path, one that connects west to east rather than north to south. The upcoming Carney-Xi meeting, if confirmed, will symbolize that evolution. For China, the summit would mark a small diplomatic victory. For Canada, it would prove that middle powers can still navigate between giants. In this new landscape, Trump's tariffs look less like strength and more like self-inflicted isolation. His America First policy has left allies searching for alternatives. Canada's outreach to China is not a betrayal. It is a reflection of a global economy that refuses to stand still. The message is clear. When trade becomes a weapon, nations find new allies. Canada's decision to reopen with China may reshape the balance of power in North America, forcing Washington to confront the limits of its own strategy. Trump's tariffs were meant to rebuild American control. Instead, they have rebuilt Canada's independence. And as the world watches Ottawa's next move, one thing is certain. The ripple effects of this policy reversal will extend far beyond Beijing, far beyond Washington, and deep into the future of the North American economy.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to impose a 100% tariff on all movies made outside of the United States. In an early morning post, Trump lashed out at other countries for stealing, quote, candy from a baby.
The announcement came early in the morning, and it sent ripples through both Hollywood and Canada. President Donald Trump declared that he would impose a 100% tariff on every film made outside the United States. For decades, tariffs have been tools used against steel, cars, or electronics. Now, for the first time, the heart of American culture is pulled into the fight. A movie today is not a car shipped across a border. It is a digital service, an international collaboration, and a product that relies on talent worldwide. That is why the threat immediately raised alarms. Instead of strengthening American film, it risks shaking the foundations of an industry built on global reach.
Is the largest and most powerful film and television industry on the planet Earth. And it got that way by exporting its product. 80% of its revenues come from outside the United States. You know, White Lotus, that a lot of people enjoy, is an entirely American show, conceived in America, produced in America, owned by America, you know, and happens to be shot in spectacular locations around the world. It defies logic entirely that that kind of a show would attract some kind of tariff.
The United States has built the most powerful film and television sector in the world. More than 80% of its revenues come from exports to audiences outside America. Hollywood became dominant precisely because it could tell stories that traveled across borders. Now, the tariff threat puts that at risk. Productions rarely stay within U.S. borders. Ice road truckers had to film in Canada because the ice roads are there. White Lotus, an American show, was shot abroad even though it was fully conceived and owned in the U.S. Beyond filming sites, studios depend heavily on outsourcing. Visual effects and post-production often go to Canada, India, Vietnam, or South Korea, where costs are lower and expertise is deep. If projects using those services are branded as foreign-made, Hollywood itself will suffer. Costs rise, projects stall, and thousands of technical jobs could be disrupted. Even before a single tariff is collected, the chill is real. Energy is wasted on legal and financial calculations instead of storytelling. A measure presented as job protection risks undermining the very workforce it claims to defend.
As Premier Ford just said, a lot of this is talk. This is saber rattling at its finest. Nothing's been decided. And rather than speculate on worst-case scenarios, what matters is how Canada responds now, how Ontario responds.
Across the border, Canadian leaders and unions are watching closely. Canada's screen industry is a vital part of the economy. National figures show more than 12 billion Canadian dollars in annual production in 2022 and 2023, with roughly $4.8 billion directly sourced from American projects. Ontario alone records a $3 billion industry. The threat from Washington is serious, but Canadian voices emphasize resilience. Stable tax credits, training, and infrastructure are seen as the keys to keeping Hollywood North attractive. Provinces like Ontario and British Columbia have long used incentives to bring in American productions, and those policies remain intact. At the same time, Canada is not cornered. The industry has strong ties to Europe, the United Kingdom, and global streaming platforms. Canadian performers and crews can still reach international audiences even if U.S. projects slow. Rather than panic, the message from Canada is to double down on domestic strength while continuing to welcome global partners. Not too slow. What emerges is a sharp contrast. In the United States, uncertainty spreads through the largest creative export sector, which depends on global sales for more than 4/5 of its revenue. Any retaliatory duties from Europe or Asia would cut directly into those profits. In Canada, by contrast, governments and unions are preparing to adapt. If American studios hesitate, Canadian producers can step forward, supported by provincial policies and international partnerships. Rather than crippling Canada, the tariff talk may highlight the advantages of filming there. The outcome is striking. A policy aimed at punishing foreign production threatens to wound Hollywood itself, while Canada steadies its own industry and looks outward. What was intended as a show of strength risks becoming another example of how Trump's tariffs backfire, leaving America weaker while its neighbor holds firm.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is continuing his globe-trotting search for trade and investment today. And this morning in Ottawa, the Prime Minister hosted his counterpart from Ireland.
This is one of our strongest relationships, culturally, economically, with respect to shared values in foreign policy.
Across the Atlantic, a striking message is taking shape. Ireland's Prime Minister has called aligning with Canada the obvious choice under U.S. tariffs. On the same day, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney left Ottawa for London to meet leaders of the United Kingdom, Spain, and Denmark. These two developments might look routine, but together they highlight something bigger. Washington's tariff campaign, designed to bring partners closer, is instead nudging them to look elsewhere. Since early September, the Trump administration has enforced its reciprocal tariff regime, removing duty-free treatment for small imports, adding surcharges on heavy trucks, and announcing a 100% tariff on branded pharmaceuticals effective October 1st. The European Union, already under a 15% ceiling on auto and parts exports to the U.S., is recalculating its options. And one of its member states, Ireland, has chosen to say the quiet part out loud. Ireland's relationship with Canada is not new. Under the provisional application of CETA, their trade has doubled over the past 7 years. The Irish government has now pledged to ratify the agreement formally this year and to send a high-level trade mission across the Atlantic. For Dublin, the motivation is clear. U.S. tariffs hit pharmaceuticals hard, a sector worth tens of billions annually to Ireland's economy. By tightening links with Canada, Irish policymakers are hedging against instability in their largest market. The relationship is not only about exports. Irish leaders have invited Canadian firms to bid on major infrastructure, such as the new metro system planned for Dublin. At the same time, Irish companies see opportunities in Canada's own large-scale infrastructure spending, from public transit to energy. Yes, there are barriers, including interprovincial trade frictions and regulatory complexity, but both governments are acknowledging them and working to streamline. With Ireland set to hold the EU Council presidency in the latter half of 2026, the political signal is powerful. Canada gains a friend with influence inside the European system at precisely the moment when Washington's approach is generating uncertainty. The Irish declaration matters not only in bilateral terms. When a mid-sized EU economy frames Canada as an obvious hedge, it legitimizes a wider realignment. Carney's meetings in London and continental capitals are part of this pattern. Countries are not waiting for tariff relief from Washington. They are writing new playbooks. Even though the US-EU framework capped most tariffs at 15%, the uncertainties surrounding Trump's policy makes diversification rational. Firms and governments prefer predictability, and right now predictability is easier to find in channels linking Europe and Canada. For the United States, this amounts to an erosion of leverage. The original goal of the tariff strategy was to pull investment and supply chains back to U.S. soil. Instead, Washington is seeing partners deepen ties with each other, often with Canada in the middle. What was meant to concentrate trade is diffusing it. For American consumers and industries, the consequences are already visible. Higher tariffs on home goods, furniture, and trucks risk pushing prices upward. The pharmaceutical surcharge may create pressure if domestic production capacity does not expand quickly enough. Meanwhile, the longer-term effect is that contracts, capital, and joint ventures are landing in Canada and Europe instead of the United States. Ireland's formal ratification of CETA and its upcoming trade mission will be milestones to watch. So will the results of Carney's European tour and any follow-on agreements between Canada and the UK. For U.S. policymakers, the lesson is straightforward. Tariffs can redirect trade flows, but not always toward their intended destination. In this case, the Ireland-Canada pivot shows that pressure designed to reinforce America's centrality is instead encouraging allies to stitch together alternatives. The real scoreboard will not be speeches, but investment decisions, export shares, and supply chain maps in the quarters ahead.